Clara Washington waited in the cold with her children until sunrise, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter Wyoming air. Snow had piled against the porch where they huddled, Emma's thin arms wrapped around 6-year-old Samuel. The wagon that brought them sat empty in the yard, the horses long since taken to shelter by someone Clara hadn't seen. She pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders. 3 days of travel through mountain passes had brought them here, to this remote ranch that was supposed to mean salvation. The advertisement had been simple enough. Widower seeks wife for companionship and help with homestead. Clara had written, back with careful honesty about her circumstances. 2 children, no family left, willing to work. The door opened with a creak that cut through the morning stillness. A man stepped onto the porch, tall and lean with graying temples. His eyes moved from Clara to the children, taking in their frost-dampened clothes and the desperate way they clung to each other. Clara struggled to her feet, her legs stiff from the long, cold night. "You must be Thomas Morrison." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man's face darkened. He looked past them to the empty wagon, then back to Clara's face. "Thomas died 3 days ago." The words hit like a physical blow. Clara felt Emma's hand slip into hers, small fingers gripping tight. Samuel pressed closer against her skirts. The wind picked up, rattling the porch boards beneath their feet. Fever took him fast. The man's voice was rough with something that might have been grief. "I'm Jake, his brother." Clara's mind raced through possibilities that all led nowhere. The last of their money had gone to the wagon driver. Winter had the mountains locked tight. No town for 50 miles, and even then, what town would take them in? "You're the mail-order bride he sent for." It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice. Jake studied her face for a long moment. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, revealed lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years. When he spoke again, his words came slow and deliberate. "You're staying." Clara blinked. "I don't understand." "Not as Thomas's bride, as my business partner." Jake gestured toward the sprawling ranch buildings, the corrals and outbuildings that stretched across the valley floor. "This place needs a woman's touch to survive. You need protection. Seems we can help each other." Emma shifted behind Clara's skirts. Samuel's stomach chose that moment to growl, loud in the morning quiet. "Thomas wasn't looking for love," Jake continued. "He was dying, and he knew I couldn't manage alone. Can handle cattle and crops fine enough, but I can't cook for 12 men, manage supplies, or keep this place running the way it needs to be run." Clara looked at the ranch with new eyes. Even from the porch, she could see signs of neglect. Tools left scattered in the yard, windows that needed washing, the kind of disorder that came when men tried to run a household without understanding how all the pieces fit together. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Partnership. You handle the house, the workers, the business side I've been making a mess of. I handle the land and livestock." Jake's eyes met hers directly. "We tell the town you're Thomas's widow, makes you my sister-in-law, gives you legal protection and social standing." The weight of deception settled heavy on Clara's shoulders. She thought of the sheriff she'd seen in the last town, the way his eyes had followed her and the children, the questions that would come if people knew she was alone. "Why would you do this?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting across the ranch. Thomas believed in second chances, figured everyone deserved a fair shake if they were willing to work for it. Samuel tugged at Clara's sleeve. She looked down to see him staring up at Jake with curious eyes, no longer hiding behind her skirts. "There's conditions," Jake said. "We do this, we do it right. Full partnership, written down, legal. You have authority over household management, worker schedules, supply purchasing. I don't interfere in your decisions. You don't interfere in mine." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but the absence of despair. "And if it doesn't work? Then we figure something else out. But it'll work." Jake's voice carried quiet conviction. "Ranch has good bones, just needs proper tending." Emma stepped forward, still holding Clara's hand, but no longer hiding. Her voice came out small but clear. "Will we have our own room?" Jake's expression softened. "House has 4 bedrooms. You and your brother can pick whichever ones you like." Clara made her decision the way she'd made all the important ones since her husband died. Quick and clean, before doubt could creep in. "I want it in writing. Full partnership terms, responsibilities. What happens if one of us wants to end the arrangement?" Jake nodded. "Fair enough, we'll draw up papers this afternoon." He stepped aside, holding the door open. Warmth flowed out from the house beyond, carrying the scent of coffee and wood smoke. Clara gathered her children and stepped across the threshold into whatever came next. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, but Jake hadn't been modest about the state of things. Dishes piled in the kitchen sink, clothes scattered across chairs, the kind of chaos that came from men who worked hard but had never learned the rhythm of keeping house. Clara set down her single traveling bag and looked around with calculating eyes. It would take work, but she could see the potential underneath the mess. Good solid construction, large kitchen with a proper stove, windows that would let in plenty of light once they were clean. "The hands eat breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6, Jake said. "Been making do with beans and hardtack mostly. Figure you might have better ideas." Clara was already moving toward the kitchen, her mind cataloging what needed doing. Emma and Samuel followed close behind, their eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings. For the first time in months, Clara felt the tight knot in her chest begin to ease. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life. And sometimes, that was enough to build on. Within a week, Clara had transformed chaos into order. She woke before dawn to start coffee and biscuits, watched the ranch hands file through the kitchen with surprised gratitude instead of resignation. Their faces changed when they tasted real food again. Even the gruff foreman, Pete, nodded his approval. The children found their rhythm too. Emma helped with morning chores, her small hands quick at sorting eggs and feeding chickens. Samuel shadowed Jake around the barn, learning to curry horses and mend harnesses. Neither child mentioned their father anymore, but Clara caught them, watching Jake with careful eyes, testing whether this new man could be trusted. Clara instituted systems the way other women arranged flowers. Meal schedules written on a board by the door, inventory lists for supplies, work rotations that kept the house running smooth as clockwork. The ranch hands grumbled at first about taking direction from a woman, especially one who looked like her. But empty bellies made quick converts, and Clara's competence cut through prejudice like a sharp blade through leather. Jake watched it all with something close to wonder. He'd grown used to living in disorder, to making do with whatever came to hand. Clara brought precision where there'd been improvisation, abundance where there'd been scarcity. Their first trip to town came 2 weeks after her arrival. Clara dressed carefully in her best black dress, the one she'd worn to her husband's funeral. She coached Emma and Samuel in the wagon. "Remember, your father was Thomas Morrison. He was Uncle Jake's brother. We came here to help Uncle Jake run the ranch." Emma nodded solemnly. Samuel kicked his feet against the wagon seat, not quite understanding why they needed a new story but willing to play along. Copper Creek squatted in the valley like something carved from the surrounding hills. Wood buildings weathered gray by wind and sun. A main street rutted with wagon tracks, the kind of place where strangers drew attention simply by breathing. Clara felt the weight of stairs as Jake helped her down from the wagon. Conversation stopped. Curtains twitched in windows. She kept her spine straight and her expression composed, the way she'd learned to do when walking through unfriendly territory. The general store smelled of coffee and leather and the particular staleness of a place where men gathered to escape their wives. The storekeeper, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked Clara up and down like she was merchandise of questionable quality. "This is Clara Morrison," Jake said. "Thomas's widow. She'll be handling supply orders for the ranch from now on." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady and businesslike. "I'll need to see your prices on flour, sugar, and coffee. Also your delivery, schedule for larger orders." The storekeeper blinked. Most ranch wives deferred to their husbands in matters of business. Clara was clearly not most ranch wives. She negotiated with quiet authority, comparing his prices to what she remembered from towns back east, asking pointed questions about quality and availability. By the time she finished, she'd secured better prices and more reliable delivery than Jake had managed in years. Outside, a small crowd had gathered around their wagon. Women with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, men who measured worth by the color of a person's skin. Clara felt their judgment like a weight on her shoulders. Mrs. Morrison. The voice belonged to a large man with a badge pinned to his vest. Sheriff Coleman had the kind of face that seemed carved from suspicious wood. Heard about your loss. Thomas was a good man. Clara inclined her head. Thank you, Sheriff. He spoke often of Copper Creek's kindness. It was a lie, smooth and practiced. Thomas had never spoken to her at all, being dead before she arrived. But the sheriff didn't need to know that. Funny thing, Coleman continued, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Don't recall seeing you at the funeral. The silence stretched thin as wire. Clara felt Jake tense beside her, saw Emma's small hand creep into Samuel's. I was too overcome with grief to attend. Clara's voice carried exactly the right note of dignified sorrow. Jake felt it best I have time to compose myself before meeting the community. Coleman nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed sharp. Of course, grief affects folks different ways. The ride home passed in tense quiet. Clara stared at the passing landscape, her mind cataloging the sheriff's questions and the weight of suspicious stares. Jake's hands were tight on the reins, his jaw set in a hard line. That evening, after the children were asleep, Clara and Jake sat by the fire going over supply lists and ranch accounts. The silence between them had grown comfortable over the past weeks, but tonight it held an edge. Coleman's going to be a problem, Jake said finally. Clara looked up from the ledger she was studying. Jake was staring into the fire, his face shadowed by flickering light. He suspects something. Suspects what exactly? Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. That you're too good for this place, too smart, too capable. Women like you don't usually end up on failing ranches in the middle of nowhere. Clara set down her pen and studied Jake's profile. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not quite bitterness, but close. What kind of woman am I, Jake? He turned to look at her then, and Clara saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. The kind that saves things, he said quietly. The kind that makes broken places whole again. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Clara felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. This wasn't part of their business arrangement. This dangerous warmth, this growing awareness of Jake as more than just a partner in necessity. She looked away first, back to the ledger, with its neat columns of numbers. Safe territory. 3 weeks later, at the church social, everything unraveled. Clara had been careful about community events, attending just enough to maintain their story without drawing unwanted attention. She helped serve food and listened to the other women's conversations with half an ear. Emma played with the other children while Samuel stayed close to Jake's side. It was Mrs. Henderson who started the trouble, her voice carrying across the church hall like a rusty bell. She spoke to her companion but pitched her words to Carrie. Strange how some people land on their feet no matter what. Thomas Morrison dies, and suddenly his widow's running that ranch better than it's been run in years. Clara's hands stilled on the serving spoon. Around her, other conversations died as people turned to listen. Makes a person wonder what kind of woman shows up at a man's doorstep just in time to inherit his property. The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the weight of judgment and speculation. Beside her, Emma's face had gone pale. That's when it happened. Samuel, overwhelmed by the tension he didn't understand, ran toward Jake across the crowded room. His small voice cut through the silence like a blade. Papa, I want to go home. The word echoed in the sudden quiet. Papa. Not Uncle Jake. Papa. Clara's heart stopped. Every face in the room turned from curious to knowing. She saw Sheriff Coleman straighten from where he'd been leaning against the wall, his eyes sharp with interest. Jake knelt and gathered Samuel into his arms, his face carefully neutral. But Clara saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders set against the weight of stairs. The ride home passed in crushing silence. Emma cried quietly in the wagon bed. Samuel didn't understand why everyone was upset, kept asking if he'd done something wrong. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Clara sat at the kitchen table staring at her hands. Jake found her there, his own face drawn with exhaustion. "It's finished," she said quietly. "They know." Jake pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maybe it's time to tell them the truth. Clara looked up sharply. "The truth? That I'm a fraud who showed up at your door pretending to be something I'm not? That'll go over well." "You're not a fraud." Jake's voice was steady, certain. "You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in years. To this family." The word hung between them. Family, not business. Partners, not convenient arrangements. Family. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been holding closed since her husband died. She looked at Jake across the table, saw the way firelight caught in his gray eyes, saw the man who'd taught her children to laugh again. "What are we doing, Jake?" The question carried more weight than just their public deception. It encompassed the way her heart jumped when he smiled, the way Samuel reached for him in the mornings, the way Emma had started humming while she worked. Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His fingers were rough from work, warm against her skin. "We're building something worth keeping." Outside, wind rattled the windows like restless ghosts, but inside, by the fire's steady glow, Clara felt something settle into place. Something that might have been hope if she'd been brave enough to call it by name. Winter struck the ranch like a closed fist. Storm after storm buried the valley in snow that refused to melt. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Jake and the hands struggled to break ice on water troughs, to haul feed to cattle that huddled against the wind like living statues. The blizzard that came in February lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared, they found 18 head of cattle frozen in the north pasture. Jake stood among the carcasses, his hat in his hands, staring at the loss that might finish them. Clara calculated the numbers in the ledger that night. The dead cattle meant they were now $500 short of the bank payment. 2 months left, and winter still had its teeth in the valley. "We could try a cattle buying cooperative," she said, her pencil tapping against the page. "Pool resources with neighboring ranches. Get better prices on stock." Jake looked up from where he sat mending harness. "Take time to organize. Time we don't have. Then we make time." But even as she said it, Clara felt the weight of impossibility, settling on her shoulders like snow. Sheriff Coleman arrived the next morning, his horse picking its way carefully through the drifts. Clara watched from the window as he and Jake talked by the barn, saw the way Jake's posture grew rigid, the way his hands clenched at his sides. When Coleman knocked on the kitchen door, Clara was ready for him. She dried her hands on her apron and opened the door with the calm expression she'd learned to wear like armor. "Mrs. Morrison." Coleman touched his hat brim, but didn't remove it. "Mind if I come in? Got some questions need answering." Clara stepped aside. Coleman's eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the evidence of competent management. His gaze lingered on Emma, who sat at the table working on lessons Clara had written out for her. "Sent some letters back east," Coleman said without preamble. "Funny thing about those letters, can't seem to find any record of you marrying Thomas. Morrison, no church records, no legal documents, nothing." Clara's hands remained steady on the coffee cup she was pouring. "Records get lost, especially during wartime." "Maybe." Coleman accepted the cup but didn't drink. "Or maybe there never were any records to lose." The silence stretched thin as wire. Emma's pencil had stopped moving across her slate. Here's what I think happened, Coleman continued. I think you showed up here with a story and a desperate need for shelter. I think Jake Morrison took pity on you and cooked up this widow tale to keep you safe. Clara met his gaze directly. And if that were true? If it were true, you'd be in violation of about 6 different territorial laws. Fraud, false representation, corrupting the moral fiber of the community. Coleman set down his cup without having tasted the coffee. Course, I'm not an unreasonable man. Might be willing to overlook certain irregularities if the right arrangements were made. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. What kind of arrangements? Coleman's smile was thin as winter sunlight. This ranch sits on some interesting geological formations. Mineral surveys suggest there might be valuable deposits beneath the grazing land. Sign over the mineral rights to me and I'll forget what I know about your marital status. And if we refuse, then I'll have to do my duty as an officer of the law. Can't have unmarried folks of different races living in sin, corrupting innocent children. There's work farms that specialize in dealing with such situations. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Clara understood perfectly. Sign over the mineral rights or lose everything, including her children. After Coleman left, Clara sat at the kitchen table staring at her hands. Jake found her there when he came in from the barn, his face gray with cold and something that might have been defeat. He made you the same offer. Jake nodded. Said he's been working this scheme on other ranchers too. Foreclosures, forced sales, legal, intimidation, all to get at mineral rights. How many others? The Hendersons lost their place last year. The Kowalskis the year before that. Always the same pattern. Financial pressure, then legal troubles, then Coleman swooping in to buy. Cheap. Clara processed this information like she processed everything else, methodically looking for patterns and opportunities. He's not just targeting us. He's targeting anyone who might have valuable land. Doesn't matter now. Jake slumped into the chair across from her. We can't make the bank payment anyway. Dead cattle saw to that. Clara studied Jake's face, saw the defeat there, the way his shoulders had curved inward like a man bracing for a blow. In the weeks since Samuel's slip at the church social, the weight of their deception had pressed down on him like stones. You want to give up. I want to keep you and the children safe. Jake's voice was rough with exhaustion. Maybe it's time to cut our losses. Clara felt something fierce and bright flare in her chest. No. Clara. No. She stood, her chair, scraping against the floor. I didn't come this far to surrender to a corrupt sheriff and his land-grabbing scheme. She moved to the window, stared out at the ranch they'd built together. The corrals Jake had repaired, the garden plot she'd planned for spring, the life they'd carved from nothing but necessity and stubborn hope. There has to be another way. That night, after Jake had gone to bed and the children were asleep, Clara climbed the stairs to Thomas's old room. She'd avoided it since her arrival, felt like she was trespassing on a dead man's privacy. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The room was sparse, neat in the way of a man who owned little and cared for what he had. A bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a trunk at the foot of the bed. Clara opened the trunk with careful hands. Thomas's clothes folded with military precision. A few books, their pages yellow with age. Letters tied with string. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a metal box. Inside the box were papers. Legal documents, property deeds, correspondence with lawyers. And at the very bottom, a document that made Clara's heart stop. A will. Dated just days before Thomas's death. Written in his own hand and properly witnessed. Clara read it twice, by lamplight, her hands trembling slightly. The will was clear and legal. Thomas Morrison, being of sound mind and body, left his entire estate to Clara Washington Morrison, his beloved wife, in gratitude for her sacrifice in coming west to care for him in his final illness. The date on the will was 2 days before Clara had even arrived at the ranch. Clara stared at the document, understanding slowly dawning. Thomas had never expected to live to see her arrival. He'd written this will as an act of faith, a gift to a woman he'd never met, but whose desperation had reached across the miles to touch his heart. She was the legal owner of the Morrison Ranch. Not through deception or convenient arrangement, but through the deliberate choice of a dying man who'd believed in second chances. Clara folded the will carefully and placed it back in the box. Tomorrow she would show it to Jake, would use it to fight Coleman's corruption. But tonight she simply sat in Thomas's room and felt the weight of an unexpected gift. Outside, wind rattled the windows and snow continued to fall. But inside, Clara felt something shift and settle, like broken bones finally healing straight. She thought of Samuel calling Jake Papa, of Emma's laughter echoing through the house, of Jake's hands covering hers across the kitchen table. They'd built something real here, something worth fighting for. Coleman wanted to take it away through legal intimidation and corrupt dealing, but Clara had spent her life fighting for survival, had learned that sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to lose. She closed the trunk and stood, the will tucked safely in her pocket. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clara felt the solid ground of legal legitimacy beneath her feet. The war wasn't over, but the terms had just changed in her favor. Clara found Jake in the barn at dawn, his hands working automatically at mending a bridle while his mind wrestled with problems that seemed to have no solutions. She approached quietly, the will folded in her apron pocket like a hidden weapon. "I found something in Thomas's room." Jake looked up, saw the controlled excitement in her eyes. Clara withdrew the document, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Jake read the will twice, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder to something approaching awe. The legal language was clear and binding. Clara Morrison, beloved wife, sole heir to the Morrison Ranch and all its holdings. "He never met you," Jake said quietly. "No, but..." He knew desperation when he saw it. Clara smoothed the paper with careful fingers. "He wrote this as an act of faith." Jake set down the bridle, his hands suddenly useless for ordinary tasks. "You own the ranch, legal and clear." Clara nodded, but even as triumph swelled in her chest, reality pressed down like winter cold. "Doesn't solve our immediate problem. Bank payments still due in 10 days, we're still 500 short." That evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen, composing a letter with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. Jake watched from across the room, mending clothes while Emma and Samuel played checkers by the fire. "Writing to family back east?" Clara paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She'd been writing to Mrs. Hartford for months now, sending detailed reports about ranch management and Western opportunities. But she'd never mentioned the true nature of her correspondence to Jake. "Mrs. Hartford, my former employer's widow." Clara chose her words carefully. "She's been interested in my observations about ranching and cattle markets." What Clara didn't say was that Mrs. Hartford had been so impressed with her business insights that she'd begun asking pointed questions about investment opportunities. The widow had money and Clara had vision. The combination might just save them all. Clara finished the letter and sealed it, then walked to town the next morning to send it by telegraph. The message was simple but desperate. Ranch facing foreclosure. "Stop. Cattle operation with strong potential. Stop. Need $500 investment for 25% partnership. Stop. Will provide detailed business plan by return wire. Stop." The answer came 2 days later. Clara read it at the telegraph office, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Wire transfer approved. Stop. Documentation to follow. Stop. Trust your judgment completely. Stop. Build something worthy. Stop." Clara walked home through snow that suddenly seemed less heavy, air that tasted of possibility instead of defeat. But even with the financial crisis solved, Coleman's threat remained. Legal ownership wouldn't matter if the sheriff could still destroy her family through corruption and intimidation. The solution came to her that night as she lay listening to wind rattle the windows. If Coleman was targeting multiple ranchers, then multiple ranchers had reason to fight back. Alone, she and Jake were vulnerable. Together they might have power. Clara called a meeting for the following Sunday. She used the network of ranch wives she'd quietly cultivated over the months, women who appreciated her practical advice and respected her competence, even if they questioned her background. They gathered in the church after services, a small group of hard-faced people who'd learned to expect trouble but still hoped for justice. Clara stood before them with the quiet authority she'd developed through months of proving herself. "Sheriff Coleman has been manipulating land sales and foreclosures to acquire mineral rights," she began. "My ranch isn't his first target. It won't be his last." Murmurs ran through the group. Suspicious confirmation of things they'd wondered about but hadn't dared voice. Clara presented the evidence methodically. The pattern of foreclosures, the convenient legal troubles that befell ranchers with valuable land, Coleman's systematic acquisition of mineral rights through coercion and intimidation. "He offered me the same deal he's offered others. Sign over mineral rights or face legal persecution," old Henderson spoke up from the back. "What you proposing we do about it? We expose him, collectively, document his corruption, and present it to the territorial authorities." The room was quiet for a long moment. These were people who'd learned to keep their heads down, to survive by not making waves. What Clara proposed required courage they weren't sure they possessed. It was Henderson's wife who spoke first. "I'm tired of being afraid of that man." Others nodded. The sentiment spread like fire catching dry grass. They formed a committee, assigned tasks, made plans. Clara felt something powerful building in the room, the kind of strength that came from people who'd finally decided to stop running. Coleman arrived at the ranch 3 days later with an ultimatum. One final demand that Clara sign over the mineral rights or face immediate legal action. He found Clara and Jake waiting for him in the kitchen, along with a dozen neighbors and a territorial marshal who'd ridden down from the capital. Clara presented Thomas's will first, establishing her legal ownership beyond question. Then came the evidence of Coleman's corruption, documented and witnessed by multiple victims. The pattern was clear and damning. Coleman's bluster died in his throat as the marshal placed him under arrest. The scheme that had seemed so powerful was revealed as what it truly was. One corrupt man preying on people too isolated and frightened to fight back. With Coleman gone and the ranch's finances secured, Clara and Jake found themselves in possession of something they'd both thought lost forever. A future worth planning for. They married in the spring, when the mountain passes cleared and wildflowers painted the valley in colors bright as hope. Not the desperate arrangement they'd begun with, but a partnership deepened by shared struggle and mutual respect. Emma and Samuel called Jake Papa without shame now, secure in the knowledge that this family was built on choice rather than necessity. Clara taught other ranch wives her business methods, spreading the skills that had saved her own family. The cattle buying cooperative flourished, bringing prosperity to the entire valley. Clara's partnership with Mrs. Hartford expanded into other ventures, creating opportunities for women who'd never imagined themselves as business owners. On summer evenings, Clara would stand on the porch that had once sheltered her desperate vigil and watch her children play in the yard. Jake would join her, his arms settling around her shoulders with the easy intimacy of people who'd chosen each other through fire. The ranch spread before them, prosperous and well-tended. But more than that, it had become what Thomas had envisioned when he wrote that will in his final days. A place where broken people could heal, where second chances took root and grew into something beautiful. Clara had waited in the cold with her children, desperate and afraid. Now she stood in warmth and light, surrounded by the family and community she'd helped build. The transformation was complete, but the story continued, written in the daily choices of people determined to create something worthy from the raw materials of hope and hard work. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.